What if you were asked to picture in your imagination the Middle East of the 19th century before photography and film? What images would come to mind? Well, quite possibly the first would be the extraordinary pyramids of Giza, Egypt, seen here in the distance, viewed from the Nile. The artist is the Italian Herman David Solomon Carodi. Likely the Great Sphinx in Giza comes quickly to mind, estimated to be 4,500 years old. It is depicted here with its full body was buried in sand and painted by the finest of the French Orientalists, Jean-Léon Gérôme. Synonymous with the Middle East is the camel, seen here in a masterpiece depicting the strange-looking and moving creature that has proven perfect for centuries of use in the Middle East. Entitled Journey of the Magi and painted by the renowned French artist James Tissot, better known for society portraits and biblical scenes. Entitled An Arab Caravan by Austrian artists Ludwig Hans Fischer, is the inseparable image of the camel caravan crossing the desert. Christian artists were drawn to scenes of Muslim piety in prayer. Entitled The Blue Mosque, brilliantly captures the devotion of the Muslim faith, painted in 1878 by, again, Jean-Léon Gérôme. The scene accurately demonstrates that the act of prayer can be expressed in any posture from prostrate to standing. The image of the hookah being smoked may come to mind, perhaps more so among younger viewers, but it is linked to Arab culture. This remarkable piece was painted in 1876 by the French artist Jean Lecomte Nuit, entitled The Smoker. He is smoking from a Gouza pipe and definitely appears totally relaxed. Crowded, bustling city street scenes exist all across the Mideast. Entitled The Gates of the Caliph, painted by William Logsdale. The figures are passing through the Bab el Zuwayya, one of the gateways into the original walled city of medieval Cairo, dating back to 1091. If your imagination can stretch back to India, this masterpiece of the 16th century Mughal Empire depicts a time when Muslim control existed over much of northern India. The American artist Edwin Lord Weeks became the most prominent artist to work in India. Now, if these or similar images came to your mind, well, besides Lawrence of Arabia, it is because they were all painted by European and American artists. Without them, the world, including the Middle East, would have little to no knowledge of the past. This is because Islam forbids creating images of Muhammad, and by extension, the human form. There was no tradition or practice in the Muslim world of accurately representing the human figure. Islamic art, as beautiful as it was, is mostly pattern and design. In short, if one wanted to discover how 19th century cities like Cairo, Istanbul, Damascus, or Jerusalem and their inhabitants looked, the best source for visual record is Oriental paintings by Europeans and Americans. And these are what we'll be looking at in this series. For a clearer understanding, the countries that the 19th century West defined as the Orient were Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Persia, and India. These countries were diverse from one to another in culture and customs, yet they held a collective fascination a uniformity of appeal to the West of the 19th century. During the late 1970s, the term Orientalism fell under severe academic attack from a group of Mideast scholars. The view expressed by these critics was that any effort by the West to represent or interpret the Middle East, by definition, was false, inaccurate, distorted, full of European chauvinism and sexism, racism, colonialism, and, frankly, any other ism that one could think of. More often, these attacks were aimed at written descriptions, analyses, etc. of the Middle East, more so than the paintings of the period. It is not our intent to get sidetracked in debating these largely forgotten preachings. The artists in Europe and America were being trained in art schools in the doctrine of realism, to observe and paint as accurately as they could what they saw. As this previously forbidden region opened to the West from the mid-1800s onwards, many complex reasons prompted visitors: search for adventure, colonial motivation, a sense of superiority, efforts to establish the Protestant ethic, expectations of erotic encounters, etc. But for the artists, it was a desire to discover and accurately portray this new world without political agendas. This was their training in realism. Accuracy and truth triumphed over prejudice. It cannot be ignored that our present-day view of the historic relationship between Christianity and Islam is often one of misunderstanding, conflict, imperialism, and jihad, each side believing the other to be the aggressor. However, through the eyes and brush of the painter, one sees great beauty, admiration, and simple human fascination portrayed throughout the region, simply referred to as the Orient. In addition to the dominant presence of Muslims, other groups will be represented as well: Hindus, Jews, Buddhists, Christians, and even pre-Muslim days of the pharaohs. Hopefully, this next segment will be the last time that this series will feel a little like going back to school. But an understanding of the roughly 2,000 years of history between the West and the Mideast, between Christianity and Islam, will add perspective to the art of Orientalism. The spread of Christianity took centuries, from a cult-like following on the fringes of the Roman Empire. It was not until Constantine adopted Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century that it spread rapidly from Western Europe to the Nile. What took Christianity centuries to accomplish was achieved by the Muslim in a comparatively few short years. In 634, Muhammad and his followers set out from Medina, Arabia, on what became known as the Muslim conquest. The earlier spread of Christianity throughout much of the Mideast established the concept of monotheism, which facilitated the relatively easier conversion to the preachings of Islam. In 6 years, by 640, Muslim armies conquered Palestine, much of Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, and in another decade, Persia. By 711, battle-hardened warriors crossed Gibraltar and seized most of Spain. To the east, Muslim armies reached the borders of modern-day Pakistan. The Christian kingdoms of Europe saw their southern borders fall and their borders threatened. The Muslim armies crossed the Pyrenees and approached Paris, until finally stopped at Tours in 732. It would take 100 years to drive them back across the Pyrenees to Spain, and that would remain under Muslim rule for 600 100 years more. The Muslim Empire remained a single, cohesive unit for only about 100 years or so, and then began breaking up into separate caliphates and emirates, and would never unite again. Nevertheless, for the next several centuries, the economies and cultures of the Muslim world would grow and flourish. Seen here is a medical school, while at the same time, Europe stagnated into poverty and backwardness. Europe was in the medieval era, while the Muslim world was at its height of civilization. For Christian Europe, Islam had taken over the very birthplace of Christ in the Holy Lands. Thus came the Christian dream of taking it back, called the Crusades. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, 9 attempts were made to conquer the Holy Land, mostly failures, but permanently solidifying an us and them between the two cultures and religions. That remains in various forms to this very day. Later, hordes of invaders occurred. The Mongols, followed by the Ottoman Empire, which took Constantinople in 1453. Shortly thereafter, conquering Greece and all of its ancient greatness and accomplishments, the pattern was set. For nearly 800 years, Christian Europe struggled to survive against armies fighting in the name of Islam. Islam was viewed as an armed religion. For most of the Middle Ages, war and Islam were one and the same. European armies were never able to conquer any Muslim territory except Spain, where the Moors were finally expelled in 1492. Arab armies had conquered Spain in 10 years, and it took Christian armies 700 years to get them out. Things began to change following the Middle Ages. The European Renaissance gradually developed across Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Sea power and navies developed in Britain, Portugal, Holland, and Spain. Quickly, Europe became the master of the seas. The Muslim forces never developed sea power. They were left out of the land grabs of European countries, reaping the riches that fueled their economies and armies. An often overlooked fact, as early as 1538, formal studies of the Islamic world began in Europe, initially fueled by fear, but continued with European emissaries visiting the Middle East, generating an increasing understanding of habits, languages, cultures, and capabilities. In contrast, the Muslim world looked down upon, ignored Europe, and had no interest in visiting, studying, or assessing European powers. This was a major contributor to the Muslim world's downfall. This continuous study in Europe became known as Orientalism. This indifference in the Muslim world led to its missing the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the benefits born of the Industrial Revolution. One of the pivotal events shaping West and Mideast development was Napoleon's ill-conceived invasion of Egypt. His forces landed in Alexandria on June 5, 1798. In addition to an army of 38,000 troops, he had a meticulously prepared group of scientists, botanists, architects, naturalists, linguists, and artists, all among the most skilled in their field, whose sole objective was to observe, record, write, and draw and transcribe everything they saw. Napoleon's armies met constant resistance among the ruling sultan's mercenary Mameluke forces, and the civilian population as well. In general, the efforts at occupation were a failure. Within 2 years, the British Navy sank the French fleet. The gradually dwindling French army could not be resupplied, and Napoleon abandoned his forces, leaving them behind to rot. Seen here, painted by French artist Jean-Charles Tardot, and entitled, quote, Halt of the French Army, 1799, is a telling image of an army in total disarray, no leadership or discipline. A soldier is seen atop a monument, scrolling a likely insult or what we would probably call today graffiti. The scientists and academics, however, amassed a body of work later published with 24 volumes entitled The Description of Egypt, considered one of the greatest gifts to history and the most important contribution to the West's understanding of the Mideast. The 19th century now becomes, quote, Europe's turn. The Muslim world learned that only a European power, France, could penetrate the heart of Islam, Egypt, and only a European power, Britain, could dislodge them. The age of imperialism was in full force. In 1821, the Greeks shed themselves of the Ottomans. In 1831, France made Algeria a colony. In 1839, the British took Aden in modern-day Yemen. By 1881, the French had taken Tunisia, and Britain formally controlled Egypt. Importantly, for our purposes, it signaled the opening up of a forbidden, exotic, mysterious part of the world. One that for 1,000 years had generated fear and wonder, mostly fear, but for the artists, wonder. We will be presenting artists from 14 different countries, depicting scenes found in 22 present-day countries. You may note little mention has been made of India. Our historical context has centered around Christian and Muslim evolution and relationship, which does not directly apply to Hindu India. Colonial activity certainly does apply, with Britain's rule over India, or the Raj, extending from 1858 to 1947. Although India was more difficult to reach than North Africa, it presented to the more adventurous artists equally exciting and exotic subjects to paint, and we'll be presenting them as well in this series. In 1856, Léon Belli expressed in a letter his intent to paint, quote, a desert scene with Arabs and dromedaries, end of quote. At that time, the camel caravan was a rarely explored subject among the early Orientalist artists. 5 years later, his masterpiece, Pilgrims Going to Mecca, was revealed and soon became the prototype for other artists to imitate, if not, frankly, outright copy. What is pictured here is a massive caravan of pilgrims en route to the holiest of Islamic cities, Mecca, on the Arabian Peninsula. At the front of the caravan is the Haji, the man who has made the arduous journey many times and has been empowered to protect and guide the pilgrims. Although the destination for the travelers is the holiest of experiences, Belli has given us a secular image of man's spirit, regardless of religious beliefs. Often in literature, camels were referred to as, quote, the ships of the desert, a wonderful image, as the curiously cushioned sensation of its steps produces a bobbing feeling like a vessel on calm waters. Many have said the desert is nothing but a sand sea, requiring the same navigational skills as a mariner on the ocean. Léon Belli was born in 1827 in northern France and made his first trip to the Middle East in 1850 at 23 years old. He traveled extensively throughout the region and paid particular attention to the unique light, especially in the desert. he was exploring how to achieve the glow of backlighting, ultimately expressed in pilgrims. All the while, he was submitting smaller works to the Salon in Paris. He was gaining attention, and one critic wrote, quote, "A strong taste of local color. The Orient of Belai is not an artificial, dainty Orient made up of pink palm trees and under a red sky," end quote. Belai returned to Paris in 1859 and devoted much of the next 2 years slowly and meticulously completing scores of preliminary drawings and oil sketches before the finished work was exhibited in 1861. Seen here is a Chinese ink drawing revealing his intended finished composition. This is a composite of drawings and oil studies of individual figures found in the finished masterpiece. When finally exhibited, it won a first-class award, and critics expressed a loss for superlatives and words with enough weight and gravity to match the painting. One critic put it more simply and truthfully, quote, "When viewers of pilgrims going to Mecca leave, they say they felt they were part of the caravan," end quote. One cannot overstate the impact of pilgrims had on other artists in the treatment of light and composition in subsequent years. Much has been written by historians about Pilgrim. In a 1977 retrospective of Leon Belai's work, it was written how essential he be known, quote, "not just as an original Orientalist who had a highly developed sense of illumination, but also as a precursor of Impressionism." After Belai's return to France in 1859, he never revisited the Orient again, but did continue to paint Arab scenes. He was attracted to the fellahin, or the rural people who lived along the banks of the Nile. Due to their continuity of beliefs and lifestyle resembling that of ancient Egyptians, they were often referred to as the true Egyptians. This very dynamic composition, entitled The Stranded Dabia, was his last painting at the time of his passing in 1877 at 50 years old. The Dabia is a vessel used to travel the Nile, flat bottom, usually with 2 sails. The vessel was clearly run aground, and the figures are desperately trying to free it. Belai was in declining health, but clearly his skills had not diminished. Throughout most of the 20th century, this work had vanished, and only known through black and white photos probably taken around the end of the 19th century. Then in 2005, it suddenly appeared at an auction in London, selling for a handsome price of $156,000. In spite of a small number of works of this quality, Leon Belai has to be viewed as, in the vernacular of today's music world, a one-hit wonder. The desert and the camel are wed to one another for 3,000 years. Without the camel, the Bedouins, Tuaregs, and other Arab peoples would remain isolated in their place of origin. And without the desert, I'm pretty sure evolution would not have been so cruel as to invent the camel, an often irritable and foul-smelling creature. First, the Sahara Desert, an ages-old source of fantasy and suffering for man. The Sahara covers 1/3 of Africa. It stretches east to west farther than the United States, 3,100 miles from Morocco to the Arabian Peninsula, and is 3.5 million square miles. It is the largest desert in the world and is believed to be roughly 6,000 years old. It has reached 136 degrees in Libya, the hottest recorded temperature on the Earth's surface because of the absence of trees and heat-absorbing soil. The day's warmth is lost, and after dusk, the temperature can drop precipitously, known to have plummeted as much as 100 degrees. The coldest recorded Sahara temperature is -7 degrees. The Sahara has generated dust and sandstorms with winds of up to 70 miles an hour. The sand blows like microscopic shards of glass into one's face. It can penetrate one's closed eyes, has often ruined car engines and buried whole camps of travelers, swallowed up man and animal alike. The Austrian artist Ludwig Hans Fischer has created one of the most dramatic images of the more unforgiving nature of the Sahara. Entitled Simoon, one of the many Arabic words for sandstorms, it dramatically pictures the disruption of a caravan, the inclusion of one of the pair of 2,000-year-old colossi of Memnon statues of the pre-Islamic pharaoh Amenhotep III, places the beleaguered caravan on the Nile Delta region on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. A more conventional and picturesque image of the Sahara is seen here, entitled Vanguard of the Caravan, painted by German artist Adolf van Meckel. This massive painting is 4.5 by 6.5 feet in size and captures the brilliant midday glare of the open desert floor, and it's almost a lavender, cloudless sky. Way off in the center distance, an approaching caravan can be seen. The figures in the foreground are hired guards or soldiers patrolling the travel route ahead of the caravan on the lookout for raiding parties. In his late 30s, Swiss-German artist Eugene Bracht traveled through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in 1880 and 1881. In a letter written by the artist, he explains that he traveled with this group of Arabs on his way from Petra in Jordan to the Red Sea. Entitled Halt on the Escarpment, a quick glance by the viewer can mistake this scene for a gathering of Plains Indians in the American Midwest. It has often been observed that North Africa and the Arab world were to European painters what the West and Native Americans were to American artists: mysterious, romantic, yet dangerous, and spectacular subjects to paint. The Sahara is not only endless tracts of sand, it can also swallow ancient cities and civilizations, leaving hints of their past glories, exposed to be seen centuries later. Entitled The Temple of the Goddess Mut, Karnak, is an exceptional watercolor gouache by German artist Karl Werner, painted in 1867. The ancient city of Thebes was a massive 36 square mile capital of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom from 2000 to 1650 BC, located in Upper Egypt along the Nile. It gradually declined, became a dangerous and distant place to visit, and disappeared under the Sahara sands. Werner has captured the crumbling remnants of a temple. The seated figures are Sekhmet, the goddess with the lioness head, and considered bloodthirsty, chaotic, and a dangerous deity of war. And, in a strange combination, love. Well, maybe they're not that too dissimilar anyway. Arguably, the most talented, most prolific, most influential of all Orientalist painters was Jean-Léon Gérôme. We've already seen his work, The Blue Mosque, Istanbul, and we'll see more throughout the series. Artists tend to love color. This extraordinary image defies the perception that the artist can't find color in the hot, bleached-out desert of the Sahara. Entitled simply Arabs Crossing the Desert, painted in 1870, is a masterpiece of the genre. Its color saturation is mesmerizing. If one stares at it long enough, with only 3 principal figures and faces all but totally obscured. Jerome has presented a quintessential image, both very real and romanticized at the same time. Now the camel, not to be confused with the Bactrian or two-humped camel found in the Central Asian steppes. The dromedary or single-humped camel is in North Africa and Arabia. To begin, and probably the most important, they can carry up to 30 gallons of water in their stomach and hump and make it last for weeks before needing another drink. They can carry 400 pounds of supplies and normally move at 3 miles an hour when fully loaded, but can, with a lesser load, travel as much as 100 miles in a full day. The designer of such a unique beast made it suitable for emergencies. In the hottest conditions, its body temperature can rise to 115 degrees without sweating, which means loss of water. It can lose up to a quarter of its body weight without suffering ill effects. When it does succumb, its meat can be cooked and eaten, and skin used for leather and blankets. If the situation demands, its hump can be opened up and the water is drinkable. The animal, is tolerated, even adored, by nomads and travelers. There are roughly 160 words in Arabic for camel. There are not sufficient words in English to describe the pain and hardships endured by pilgrims trying to reach Mecca. They were often city folks, not desert-hardened Bedouins. This extraordinary image is entitled The Halt of the Caravan by Italian artist Gustavo Simoni. Might lead the viewer to believe these beleaguered-looking figures were on their last legs. This scene is in the western part of the Sahara, referred to as the Maghrib, and depicts the Kabylie region of Algeria, where the long-suffering and persecuted Berbers reside. Looks can deceive. It's most likely leading a wedding ceremony. Note the young woman inside the camel litters. Some works leave no room for misinterpretation. This gruesome image, entitled, quote, The Land of Thirst, end of quote, by Eugene Fromentin, graphically warns the viewers of the extreme dangers of the desert. Fromentin was an early French artist to visit Algeria in the 1840s. His exceptional skill is unquestioned. In the body of Orientalist art, there are very few works that are this direct, this clear, and absent of any sentimentalism. We have a title, quote, A Master of Exile. It barely touches the difficulties in German-born Gustav Bauernfeind's life. You will question how an artist capable of works that you're about to see could die virtually in total obscurity. Even in his home country, for most of the 20th century, his name rarely appears in general art reference books. Entitled Market in Jaffa, painted in 1887, reveals the extraordinary skill of his mature Orientalist work. Bauernfeind's early career, painting in Italy, showed promise. He first visited the Mideast in 1880 at 32 years old, and soon made his way to Lebanon and Palestine, which became the focus of his work for the remainder of his career. He painted numerous street scenes in Jerusalem, Damascus, and Jaffa. entitled, quote, "At the Entrance of the Temple Mount, Jerusalem," end quote, is not only one of his masterpieces, but is a symbol of the Mideast's great dilemma. For Jews, the Temple Mount is the site of the original Temple of Solomon. For Muslims, it is the location of the third holiest site in Islam. The Dome of the Rock is seen here in brilliant sunlight in the background. The location is sacred to both groups who feel a deep connection to it and the right to its possession. Although the two great religions are seen here, the meeting does not appear confrontational. In fact, it's felt that Jews living under Muslim rule during the Middle Ages fared better than those living in Christian Europe. Throughout numerous extended trips in the Middle East, Bauernfein's existing letters back home reveal persistent health problems of all kinds, especially heart problems and bouts of depression. While wrestling with these issues, he created his masterpiece, 4.5 by almost 10 feet in size, entitled Jaffa, Recruiting of Turkish Soldiers in Palestine, 1885. This work contains close to 100 figures and is a scene of profound pain and sadness that Bauernfein witnessed. It is a scene as old as armies, as old as empire itself, the forced recruitment of its subjects for military service. With the exception of the Turkish soldiers in military uniforms and the steam vessel off on the horizon, this scene looks like it came right from the Old Testament. By this time, the Ottoman Empire was descending into an inefficient, corrupt, and poorly administered bureaucracy. Its subjects in Palestine, Lebanon, and Arabia were disgruntled and an abused people. The fate of the forced conscripts was no better than a labor camp or slavery, and it was likely none would ever return home to their families. The figures on the shore, backs to the viewer, are mostly women seeing their husbands and sons carted off and likely never seen again. A desperate mother is seen wading in the water, holding her baby over her head, pleading for her husband's return. This is a picture in hell, lives being ruined by forces beyond one's control, pain and suffering, quite likely felt by the artist who painted it as well. At age 41, living in Germany, Gustav Bauernfein married and had a son 3 years later. His career as an artist began to flounder, and his principal client was no longer purchasing his work. Desperate efforts to find employment as a teacher or a curator in a museum failed. By 1896, at 48 years old, he made a crucial decision to face an uncertain future and return to the land whose spell he fell under almost 2 decades earlier. Bauernfein spent his remaining 8 years in Jerusalem, painting, occasionally traveling in other regions of the Middle East, and always struggling financially. He severed contacts in Germany as friends and relatives gradually passed away. Upon return from a trip to Beirut, he suffered a heart attack and passed away on Christmas Eve, 1904. For the next 2 years, his wife sold his remaining paintings to tourists at bargain prices, thus guaranteeing they would be scattered throughout the world. At her funeral, 2 years later, their 10-year-old son attended the burial service. He was the only one there. The last work Bauernfein painted in 1904 was entitled The Wailing Wall, Jerusalem, also known as Solomon's Wall or the Western Wall. He painted this site of deep significance to the Jewish faith on more than one occasion. At the end of the wall, in the distance, one can see a small home with seated figures most likely a sign of disrespect. Housing had been built up to within yards of the wall itself. It is ironic that Gustav Bauernfeind's masterpiece, Recruiting of Turkish Soldiers, befell the same fate as Leon Belai's standard Dahabia. It too was lost for a good part of the 20th century. In Gustav Bauernfeind's case, it's sad that it took more than a half century to achieve recognition even in his own country. The Orient of the 19th and early 20th century attracted legions of visitors beyond just artists. It was an era when the public devoured books, newspapers, and travel journals about the Orient. Drawn to the region were writers, poets, generals, missionaries, diplomats, linguists, and explorers. Accounts of lost explorers like David Livingstone, deaths of idealists like Lloyd Byron, and figures, quote, going native, as in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, fueled the public's imagination. There were the few truly heroic explorers who achieved remarkable things that are lesser known today because their objective was discovery, not self-promotion, riches, or fame. Swiss-born in 1784, Jean-Louis Burkard's early life was disrupted by the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars and left him in England at 21 years old with limited prospects. Burkard had a chance meeting with a member of the British African Association, which fostered and fueled efforts to expand knowledge of Africa, including the Mideast. Through repeated efforts in 1809, Burkard received approval to enter the mysterious city of Timbuktu in present-day Mali and locate the source of the Niger River, disguised as a Moorish trader. Many months of language study, dress, behavior, and customs were undertaken before he began a 9-year journey, alone and always in character. He never once revealed his identity, being discovered by the many cautious locals he encountered would mean death. The original plan was to depart Cairo by caravan and eventually work his way to Timbuktu. But endless revolts between the Wahhabi sect against the Turkish Pasha resulted in very few caravans departing for several years. These constant postponements resulted in Burkard taking extended trips elsewhere. His first discovery of significance occurred in the midst of a bazaar in Syria, where a block of stone in a construction site seemed older than the others, with unrecognizable writing on it. Sent back to England, it took a half century to confirm it was Hittite hieroglyphs, and Burkard's sharp eye confirmed the existence of an entire ancient civilization discovered in the midst of a populated town. En route to Palestine, he became fascinated by legends of Petra, home of the Nabateans, which flourished during the last centuries before the birth of Christ, eventually falling to the Romans in 106 AD and gradually fading into obscurity. Burkard took the name Sheikh Ibrahim, and with the aid of very superstitious Bedouins, was the first European in 600 years to discover Petra on August 22, 1812. This painting, by the American artist Frederick Church in 1874, captures the long, narrow corridor called El Sikh, revealing El Kasni at its end. Burkard was forced to remain in character as a disinterested, illiterate peasant. his guide kept urging him to move on. Thus his time spent gazing at this remarkable sight was painfully short. This hand-colored lithograph by Scottish artist David Roberts is the view he would have seen as he exited the corridor. He continued making notes in secret, often concealing them in his turban, and forwarding them back to England whenever he was back in Cairo. Burkard traveled further south on the Nile, noting frequent ruins and vestiges of earlier civilizations, until on March 22, 1813, he arrived at a place the natives call Ebsambal, on a summit high above the Nile. This lithograph by David Roberts clearly shows the long cascade of sand descending almost to the Nile's edge. The image actually portrays Roberts' arrival boat pulled up on the shore. Burkard approached from the desert and descended from above, not realizing what he discovered till he reached the bottom. There he saw the 4 colossal statues of Ramesses II, perhaps the most extraordinary ancient ruin in Egypt after the Great Pyramids. Momentarily free of his nagging Bedouin guides, the young explorer was the first European in 1,000 years to view Abu Simbel, again portrayed by David Roberts. These images of the 3rd and 4th figures were painted in 1899 by the preeminent American watercolor Orientalist who was living in Egypt, Henry Roderick Newman. Few, if any, artists ever captured the texture of sun-baked stone. By 1816, Burkard was back in Cairo, anxiously awaiting a caravan to pursue his original assignment, to find the source of the Niger. 9 years had elapsed, always in character and traveling alone. He had weathered countless fevers, infections, and diseases. His last package of writings were sent to England the summer of 1817. In October of 1817, he fell ill with dysentery and, surrounded by his Muslim friends, died at 34 years old. He was largely unknown in England. It's likely his Muslim friends in Cairo never knew his real name, and yet he had gained so much respect among local Muslims that, well, despite rumors that he might be a European and a Christian, or at least once was, Jean-Louis Burkard was buried among their own in the city of the dead. For episode 2, we'll explore the uniquely Arabic word kaif, said to be untranslatable in English, but means dreamy tranquility, absent of worry and unpleasant memories and conversations, greatly aided, of course, by the contents of the hookah, goza, or water pipe. We'll explore, perhaps, the greatest Russian, actually Ukrainian, painting ever, depicting the war-loving Zaporozhye Cossacks. Last, we'll look at a number of young Americans who sought further studies in Europe, who discovered Orientalist paintings by their European peers and soon ventured into the Orient themselves.